Welcome to episode 3 of season 2 of Matire Gemi, a bi-weekly podcast where we help you learn the Mûgîkûyû culture, history, and heritage in English and in a fun, light-hearted way. I'm Irua Diho, Mojiro wa Barea Kehara, and today I'm joined by Wayaki and Kengori Wakanyi. Now, today's discussion is a really eye-opening one, and it's actually an important and sometimes highly controversial discussion. Now, why do I say that? I say that because today we're going to be talking about Irua. We're going to be talking about Irua, which is sometimes called circumcision, and yet the word circumcision does not fully capture the magnitude of Irua. Now, why do I say that? I say that because what I learned today is that Irua goes beyond the physical cutting. And in fact, it was a key and integral part of the mental and spiritual transformation that a boy underwent to become a man and a girl underwent to become a woman. So what you're going to discover today is that, as part of Irua, education and enlightenment of the Mûgîkûyû man and woman was the outcome, because Irua infused a blueprint for life, and it really gave a person's life light. So then think about this. If Irua is so integral to being a holistic human, then what happened when we began to practice the aspect only of circumcision, the physical circumcision aspect only? What happened when we lost the mental and the spiritual Irua, the mental and the spiritual education that brought forth enlightenment of the Mûgîkûyû man and woman? What were the consequences? Lean in, guys, because today Wayaki and Kengori really pull us into an eye-opening, enlightening, and need I say, delicious conversation. Enjoy. All right, Wayaki and Kengori, thank you for being here. And let's go ahead and start with you, Wayaki, introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what we'll be talking about today.
Thanks, Njeri. My name is Wayaki Wageshaga. De moshara wa Barea Muturi. Bare nini ya higa. De muihuana airimo a Barea Bogo. Na omuthenya ni njugaga ni thayo. So yeah, today we're going to talk about Irua, which is the process of circumcision in our culture. Mm-hmm. And that's the topic that we're going to go ahead and talk about its history, its philosophy, and its importance.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And then before we continue, Kengori, why don't you introduce yourself?
Greetings, everyone. My name is Kengori. Ito Kengori Wakanyi. De moboi wa Barea Marigo. Wagetha kukia muruga. Na de wihua na aithiegeni a Barea Rugu. Rikania wathani de Mwangi. Gaciarwo ni Maina. Thayo. Ndamugeithi nyothe.
Thank you so much both for introducing yourself. And Wayaki, now we're going to be talking about this big topic, right? Topic of importance in our culture. The idea of Irua circumcision, which was for both boys and girls with the pre-colonial Mûgîkûyû. So let me turn it back to you, Wayaki, to just kick us off and let us know where we're going.
So before we talk about Irua, I want to correct something that we said in the previous podcast on the etymology of the word Mûgîkûyû. So we stated that Mûgîkûyû comes from the word to legislate, or goshira, but I got a correction from one of my mentors who mentioned to me that the word Mûgîkûyû, the etymology is goshira, and goshira is to settle, or to, what in Kikuyu we say kwehada, to plant yourself somewhere, which correctly talks about what a home is where you settle and where you plant yourself as a family. And also
I like that so much. So the Gira centered the home, it planted the home, it gave the home roots.
The Vigira and the Nyoba.
Oh, sorry.
actually.
Yes, the Vigira. Sorry. Yes.
Yes, and also the Shira comes from there's a ruling generation called Shira, which came before the generation called Madhavi, and they are the ones who kind of learned how to plant and use farming implements to farm. So that's why they were called Shira. So yeah, I wanted to correct that because at the end of the day, we are a podcast that does research, that does history, and sometimes we'll make a mistake, and we want our audience to correct us and so that we can be able to give out the right information.
Agreed. Thank you so much for correcting that for us. We really appreciate that. Okay, so I think now it's time to turn over and talk about Irua.
Okay, yeah. So I'll briefly kind of talk about what the history from a Mûgîkûyû standpoint is, in terms of the fact that there are many books that have been written on the process of Irua, or what Irua is, which used to happen for both young men and young women. But Irua, from what we've been told or what I have heard, is it started with Gĩkũyũ. It started with him, and there's a story, and maybe Kingori, you've heard this story. There's a story that is told that goes into great detail on the process of how Gĩkũyũ was circumcised and how Mobi went through that process. This story is told in Kikuyu, and we can't be able to tell it here, but it has a very detailed history on the process that God took Gĩkũyũ through and made him go through that process of Irua. So we want to say that the process of Irua didn't come from other cultures, and also the fact that many cultures in the world do perform circumcision. The Jews and many cultures in Africa do go through the process. Even in Kenya, do go through the process of becoming or coming of age, and moving from the process of being a child to being a grown-up. I don't know if you want to add something, Kingori.
No, I think for me, it's just to say that you're right. From the very beginning of the Kikuyu story, when we talk about Gĩkũyũ na Mobi, we see that solidly planted there. It is a practice that has always been with our people. And, sometimes, and this is a cautionary tale, perhaps, that when you're reading through some of these books, there's a lot of thinking that goes in there, and logic when people are writing these books. And they will look around and they'll say, we're seeing some similarity between the way Mûgîkûyû does it and the way Masai does it. And then they will assume these guys must have learned from these guys, right? Those are scholarly attempts to give answers, because people haven't taken the time to go through they understand the kerera behind it to really see where it's coming from. So it is important as we do our research. Yes, sometimes we will be deriving some information from some books that were even written by outsiders, but the best thing is always to go and talk to those elders and understand that kerera from a perspective of Gĩkũyũ, and not necessarily what someone else came to think for themselves after observing. So, but yeah, I agree. This is purely a Mûgîkûyû concept and affair, and it kind of it looks like it grew from our origins and has always been with us.
I love that so much. Now, before we continue, Kingori, for the sake of our listeners that don't understand as much Gĩkũyũ, what is kerera? You've said that word twice.
Oh yeah, that's a very, very important question. So, kerera is our living and breathing wisdom of the Mûgîkûyû. It is a knowledge that has been passed down for many, many, many generations. And it continues to just expand as you start to listen into it. To just make it very simple, it is Gikoyo wisdom and knowledge around all matters of life.
I love that. Is that similar to, say, education? Is that similar to how we pass information down today? Is it education?
Sure. I mean, it is a form of education. It is a deeper form of education. So, and actually, we will talk about this today, because much about Irua, about what we call circumcision today, much about it is about education, right? And you have to draw a distinction between, let's say, today's literacy and education. And there's a big difference. Literacy, we understand, it's how to read and write, how to count, and how to do some basic math. And as you pick up knowledge around that literacy will take you to Form 4 or, high school and all the way to university, because you're learning how to do certain functions that are expected of you just on a day-to-day basis. Education is knowledge about yourself first. If you're not learning something about yourself, about your environment, you're not educated. So if all you know is book information and you've never gone to research, who am I, who was my grandmother, grandfather, and you haven't gone back to understand who are our people, what trajectory are our people in, and where are we likely to go forward, and also be able to contribute to that, then your education is kind of stunted. And what you are is a literate person, but really, this is where I don't know if we have fans of reggae who are listening, but you'll hear a term like educated fools, right? And that's kind of, you're literate, right? You know so much, but you don't know yourself, right? You don't know your people. And Kerera is that bridge. It's understanding the self, it's understanding your community and be able to project further and looking forward. And even as we talk about Irua today, that's the focal point. It is when you, even in a Mûgîkûyû child, that is a moment where a lot about the self, a lot about the community becomes availed to them. That knowledge gets transferred mostly during that time. And we'll get into that in a bit, I'm sure.
I'm loving that so much, and the connection between Irua and self-knowledge or self-awareness. Ooh, Wayaki, let me pass it on to you to just continue this dialogue on Irua.
Yeah, I can't be able to put it the way Kingori did so well, but the process of Irua was the most important step, or is the most important step. When we talk about culture, sometimes we say was, but we are in the culture. That culture is still going on. So it is the most important step. And maybe it was considered the most important step, and we should consider it the most important step in bringing out the future men and women of our tribe, of our culture. And that's the step where men and women were made to realize who they really are. They were given the education for their life. Today we are getting, like Kingori is saying, we are taken to school, Sunday school, we go to primary school, high school, university. But, you graduate, you have a master's or a PhD. But, you're still soul searching to find out who you are. So that was the process of discovering yourself and being made aware that this is who you really are. This is who we really are. And this knowledge is going to help you in your life.
So, I love that intentionality in the culture of self-knowledge and self-awareness, right? Because I think we recognize that today in our education system, that's one of the biggest things that we lack. And usually once we're done with our education, that's when we start going down these journeys where we're asking, who am I? right? To realize that there was this intentionality, right? And the mark of moving from one step, maybe childhood to adulthood, for men and women was actually marked with this process of self-awareness and self-discovery, and being educated about that is just so magnificent. So I think the big question I would ask, and maybe I'll pass it on to you, King Ori, is how did that, because for me it's fascinating, how did this process of Irua get people to discover themselves? Like, what was that mechanism?
Right, and the kerera around Irua, I want to give our listeners fair warning. It is very extensive. It is not something that any one person, even the best of us who have been looking into, our knowledge, our kerera, it is not something that can be easily mastered. It will take many decades to master it. And even back in the day when people were immersed in the process of learning, it used to be the deepest kerera you could ever attempt to master. So in our podcast today, there's some level of detail we cannot attempt to get into, but I'll answer your question in the best way that I can. So the whole thing starts with Marogo, which is the different steps of a Mûgîkûyû's life, or the different stages of a Mûgîkûyû's life. For those who, if you listen to last season, I think it was episode 9 or so, we talked about different stages of our lives. And if you look at both the boy and the girl, or both the man and the woman, you'll find that they had 9 stages. And then those 9 stages were actually broken down in 3 different stages. So there's what is a childhood, right? And that childhood starts with, a couple of years before that child has been, has gone through the process of Goshiarona Borio, to be born again. There was a process there. Those children were called Shora. And then they went to be, if it was a boy, became a kahe, the girl became karego, and then kerego, and then kehe. Those were the steps in childhood. Now, once you've gone through those steps, and all those steps have graduation points. But the biggest graduation now came when you went from being a kehe as a boy to now be called mwanake, right? And something special was happening here, because this is that opportunity to transform yourself from being a kehe to a mwanake was very relished. People looked forward to that. Young men looked forward to that. Or we say boys looked forward to that. The girls looked forward to that too when they would become moiretu. And what used to be discussed there was a long process that started way before they got to becoming mwanake through that process that we're talking about. It's a very long process. The boys would be prepared gradually and over many years. So, and this is a very important step where these were very important steps where the mama, the uncle, the maternal uncle, would be very involved in gauging, is this young boy maturing at the pace that we expect? And that's where you used to see things like the ear piercings we call dogera start to appear. Because dogera means when you got that ear piercing, it was something that your uncle, your maternal uncle, used to actually procure for you. There was goats that he was paid to allow that to happen. When those dogeras were being put, they meant that you are mature enough to be given some certain information and be able to retain it, right?
Yeah.
And there was a procedure of making sure that you are mature, you are getting close to this all-important ritual of Irua, and you're being carefully monitored, and you started being given some level of kerera coming to a culmination, so that you get to that culmination.
Yeah.
At the same time as you're being prepared to become...
Actually, before you continue, can I add something?
Sure.
Because I love this so much, right? And I just don't want to lose this, because when you are speaking, right, the magnificence of the process hit me, right, so far. And what hit me is what you're saying here, that first and foremost, there's a designated person, the mama, the maternal uncle, right, who makes sure that this boy, and I don't know the equivalent of the mama for the girl, right, is actually ready, right? That there's somebody who's doing an assessment on this child for their readiness for the process, right? There's somebody who's doing it objectively, because we all know that if you receive information before you're ready, it will just become information and it will not transform you. So I just did not want us to miss on the wisdom of what you just said, which is there was somebody who was regularly checking in and assessing the readiness, so that when the boy went through the process, they were ready. It was time. They were mature and they could absorb all of this kirira, this self-knowledge, all this information that was being passed on to them. That is just so beautiful. And thank you for allowing me to interrupt you. Go ahead, King Ori.
Yeah, thank you. No, that you're really highlighting a very important part of it. It is that preparedness. It took many steps, right? And it was multifaceted. So there's one track, like we just talked about, where you're being assessed for your maturity. There's another track where you are being encouraged to do the most ohe things possible, to do the most childish activity possible, so that you can get it out of your system, right? So they understood you're young, you're still young, and you need to be encouraged to do them. In fact, you are kind of pushed to do some extra ohe, kind of kohera, we call it kohera, which is an actual step pre-Irua, where you're doing this crazy stuff. Now, you asked a very important question: who would be the one preparing the girls if they were going through this process? And before I answer that about the girls, we may not get into the girls so much today, because, in Gikuyu we say, I don't think Wayaki and I know anything about it. We know just the very veneer of what it used to be like, and we can discuss it. But we may, because it's not a process we have gone through, we may not be the ones to talk about it. And let's not forget that in Kenya, in today's Agikuyu society, I think there's there's a near unanimous acceptance that Irua ria moiretu, at least as far as the physical, is something we're not interested in. It is something we've allowed to expire and put in it's a historical issue now. We can talk about it historically to review it, but it's not a living kirira that we are engaging with today. So we won't get too much into that. Only to note,
Yeah.
But there are some issues we can talk about very lightly.
I think that's fair, and if Wayaki wants to add to that, I think that's very fair. And just in what you just said, I also think something magnificent about this culture, our culture, that I loved is when you talked about ohi, that a child is encouraged to live out their childhood, to be the full child in that stage, because we all know that if you don't fully express yourself for the stage of your life that you are in, then that stage always seeks to express itself perhaps the wrong way in the future, right? And I think that is so beautiful, so beautiful. And I can see why we'll not go into the women's part of the Irua, but I think it might be worthwhile at some point to really ask ourselves if there was value, right, in this process. And when we have removed the process of Irua for girls, right, have we lost something in removing that? I think that's going to be a worthwhile discussion to have later. So I'm going to pass it back to you, King Ori and Wayaki, to just continue this discussion, because I am enjoying it.
Let me let Wayaki add a few points to that, and then we'll proceed, right?
Yeah, let me add a few things on there. So, to add on to what King Ori said about the deepness and the enormity of the Kirira Kiairua, there are certain things. There are certain things that we can't go into, obviously. there's a saying that says, wakahe doshiragero ne moru. So, we've gone through the process, so we can't be talking about the kirira that other young men are going to go through in the future. So we are going to just be really high level. I wanted to add that on there. And then also, for our listeners who want to learn more about this kirira in depth, there's also a saying in our community that says, kirira kehoyagwo wanaruithia. So, find somebody who has actually taken young men through the process, who has that knowledge, and who can actually give you the in-depth philosophy and wisdom of this kirira. The third thing I want to say is, even as we don't touch the process of what the girls used to go through, in the education part, I'll talk about what we have lost by not going through the education part of the process. Like King Ori said, this the Irua process for girls has been passed by time, but there's certain things that we have lost, and we'll contrast it with today. And I'll touch on that later. I won't touch on it now.
Love it. Thank you. All right, King Ori, what you were talking about, the process was so beautiful. So I'll turn it back to you to continue that conversation you were having.
Thank you. So there's a lot happening prior to what we call Irua Reakahio, or the actual circumcision. Another word you'll hear being used is demego, to cut. And this is where we need to first of all understand there are actually three things happening while you're going through this process. And this is where sometimes English is very limited. Circumcision just talks about, it's really talking about something that happens physically. It's a surgery. But Irua as a word means a lot more. Irua had to be distinguished between Irua rea kahio and Irua rea omo. And the omo part was two-part in itself. And that's why I said the whole thing was three parts to Irua. Omo used to be a process of transformation. And that's how they used to look at it. That it is that part that's more instruction and less physical things that you're doing. So Omo used to be mind and soul, or spirit, or getting you connected into your spirituality in very literal ways. Now, all of these three things went hand in hand, because this was the first time where a person's blood would be shed very, very intentionally through this process. And as you know, Mûgîkûyû used to take blood very seriously. So there's a spiritual aspect that has to do with this blood. Whose blood are you spilling? You have to first understand it's not just if it's Kanyi who's going through that process. That blood is a blood that actually is shared by two different lineages. And that's the first time the young man will start really understanding that. And that's why we used to have to go and remember, it is the boy's father who would have sponsored this whole thing to get it going. But it is the uncle, the maternal uncle, who would take up a lot of the responsibility. And this is where you're seeing those two lineages come in. Each one of these two men are standing in the gap of their ancestry. And both of them are saying, we've blessed this young man to go forward with this process. And we've agreed that blood should be shed, our blood collectively, right? And that's part of the spiritual part of it. And what happens is that young man is actually now, by spilling that blood, being enjoined with his ancestors who have long gone, by spilling the blood the same way their ancestors did on those riverbanks. So there's a spiritual connection. And once that happens, it is the reason why Mûgîkûyû believes that ihe right, uncircumcised boys usually were exempt from a lot of things, even repercussions from their actions, right? They could get away with murder, because that used to be the father's responsibility, over him. And now, for the first time after he has shed that blood and has been enjoined with his ancestors, he now becomes accountable for himself. And moving forward, that becomes modomogima. That becomes someone who is, they can be held accountable for their actions. So it's not just a privilege; it also was a huge responsibility now. And that's why the preparation used to be very extensive, because now, as yesterday you were a boy, this morning when you woke up or when you went to that riverbank, you had now been transformed into being a full member of the Gikuyu community with all responsibilities, and you are really a different person. So the preparation of leaving Ohe behind, as we were talking about, had a lot to do with dances that were very fabulous, that went on for many, many days prior to this moment. They even had a function, and just to give our listeners a little taste of what we're talking about, these boys could go down and, because they used to hang around in packs leading up to this moment, they were encouraged in that kohera process to go and visit different families or different women's abodes. And they would go and they would sing, usually very naughty songs, or very funny songs. And the women would be very happy to feed them because that was very funny, and or something that was extremely naughty, and they wanted to give them food to just chase them away. They would, that would happen. Things like that would happen, and they would eat a lot leading up to this, right? But there was actually a real function. People who were known to be akare, people who were known to lack generosity, especially because it was one of those things that women were expected to do, is to be generous with their giving of food and things like that. Women who were known to be not so generous would usually face the wrath of these young men or these young boys, because they would know that. They would just know that person doesn't give. And so they would go there, and this would be the opportunity to kind of push them into giving. And they would sing very naughty songs. And usually it was one of those things where the communities, you're being punished by your boys because you have a history of not being motana or generous. And so they would use that opportunity to just sing these songs and just stick there until you give, and you give a lot. And those were some of the ways that it was a poetic justice of sorts that would happen, that you'd be pushed into that. But so there was function to some of these funny things the boys would be getting into. But for them, it was a huge learning opportunity about even understanding, hey, if it's something like Otana, that is a big deal, being generous in the community. And they would learn that firsthand because they were the ones now meting out a quote-unquote punishment for people who were not very generous. But, there was a lot of those kinds of activities leading up to it. That we don't want to get into it because that's a lot of time to discuss all of them. The dances, the physical test of strength activity that was happening. One of them is you could not be allowed to go to the Irua or to participate if, for example, you couldn't take a club. That rungu, you all know it, and be able to throw it over a mogumo tree. It was one of those things. If you know people who went to school a little bit earlier, you'll hear them say something like, before we were admitted to standard 1, we had to be able to hold our ear over our head. You have to hold your ear on the other side, like a test to say you're old enough. In this stage, one of those things was to be able to throw that club over a mogumo tree. It was to be able to show that you can handle a spear and things of that nature, to show that you're strong enough.
I love that, right? And what I love so much about what you just shared is that Today, when we think about the word circumcision, right, when we say that a boy has gone to get circumcised, we think only of the cutting, like you said, right? But what you've showed us is that it was so much deeper, that there were three aspects to the idea of korua, right, and Irua. So I think that is so beautiful. And before I pass it on to you, Wayaki, I wanted to share a little story. So one time I asked my dad where the name Diho comes from, because it's a very unique name. There's not a lot of people with it. And if they're from Kiambu, we are likely very related. We are related in some way. So the name Diho actually came from a mama. I think it was my grandfather, don't quote me, who was going through the Irua process, my paternal grandfather. And in the process, he was being sponsored by his mama, Diho. And through that process, right, I think to honor Diho, and don't quote me, but somehow then we adopted that name. So the option is either Mwaura or Diho. Those are the two names. It's Mwaura and Diho, and it comes from the mama, right? And it came on. It was taken on during the Irua process.
Wow, the mama is very, very important in our culture, and that's why you have the name Diho. So let me add a few things to bolster Kingori's thoughts on blood, especially because when you go through the process of Irua, blood is spilled. So, when you're born and there's blood that is spilled, your umbilical cord is cut, and you spill blood not voluntarily, right? That, of course, you can't control because you're a child. So when it gets to the process of Irua, you are willing to spill your blood voluntarily. So there's a very big difference between when you were born and when you're going through the process of Irua. And because in our culture, it's a mogiro, or it's a taboo, or it's something that's forbidden to kill someone, to kill an animal without a purpose. Basically, it's forbidden for you to spill blood. But when you go through the process of Irua, where you have voluntarily said, I am willing to go through this process, I am willing for my blood to be spilled, then that graduates you and you are allowed, for example, to slaughter a cow, slaughter a goat. You're allowed. And then, of course, when our young men, when they passed through that process, they joined warrior ranks, right? So, and as a warrior, you could inadvertently, because it wasn't the purpose of the Mûgîkûyû when they went to Utaha or Ita, it was not their purpose to go and kill. They were just going to raid and collect cows and goats. But if they killed, they had already been allowed that process because they went through the process and they were given the permission to be able to spill blood. So there's a very deep connection with that blood being spilled during Irua voluntarily, because then it allows you to be able to become, when you're a man of your own house, for example, you can slaughter goats, you can perform magogona, because you have gone through that process. And in fact, if I can go back, so I can be able to explain a saying that says, Bori etare gerima de geruta igogona. What that means is a goat or a sheep that doesn't have the marking of its moherega. If it doesn't have the marking, is what we call in English branding, right? It cannot be able to minister in a ritual or a ceremony. And that's the same with a man who has not gone through the process. In our culture, who hasn't gone through the process of Irua cannot perform magogona. Because Irua, at least the Iruaria de Mego, which is the cutting, is the branding that shows that you're a Mûgîkûyû man. That's the marking. And so I just wanted to kind of make that clear that, yes, blood is very important and we take that very seriously. And in fact, during when the girls were going through the circumcision, they were taught many things about, like their menses and how to take care of that, because, a Mûgîkûyû is forbidden to spill blood. And blood has a deeper purpose and meaning through the Irua process.
I love this so much, and I almost want to ask this question, right, for men and women, which is the idea that what you both are sharing is the power, the holisticness, the spirituality behind Irua. It's not just the cutting. The cutting is important, right, and the blood spilling, but it's deep. So today, for some of us, when we go, so two things. For some of us, when we go to hospital, right, to get circumcised, that's the event. It's the cutting, right? And for some of us, in society, we don't get the other aspects. The kerira, I'm assuming, by the way, I don't know, right? I could be wrong. You guys might tell me, boys, when they're transitioning over to manhood, get it. I don't know. I'm assuming we just go to hospital and it's done. And then for girls, we actually don't even go through the process, right? Which means that we also, the cutting process, but also we don't get the other aspects beyond the cutting. So the question is, if someone here is listening and either they're going to go through Irua themselves, right? They're of age, or they're going to take a child through it, like, how can we make sure that they're getting the holistic process? What do they do? Where do they go? So that it's not just the activity of going to hospital and getting the cutting aspect of Irua to happen.
Before I answer that, answer that question, let me add something to kind of, because that the answer to that question is very important, and I'll let Kingori answer that question. But I want to kind of show what we missed by missing that education, right? For both men and women. And I want to say that process is going on in Kenya, and there's a lot of resurgence in cultural matters that are encouraging young boys to go through that process of education and to go through and be educated in the ways of becoming a man, and so on and so forth. But I want to kind of paint a picture of what is missing and the disconnect in our society, right? So this process prepared young men to become providers, fathers, go out into the world and taha. Well, taha today is going to get an education, going to start a business, going to get a job, and to be able to be providers, right? And then that education prepared young girls to be women, to usher them into womanhood, to usher them into learning how to take care of children, take care of a husband, and so on and so forth, right? So we are missing. So in today's process, when we miss that, both men and women are being prepared for the same thing. They're being prepared to go into the workforce, being prepared to go and start businesses, right? So both of us are being prepared to go and do the same thing. The Mûgîkûyû used to prepare the man to do certain things, the woman to do certain things. I'll give you an example. So when in the girls' education process, they would be taught about how to study the moon, which is called Mweri. And we know what Mweri is in Kikuyu. It's month, but it also means your menstrual cycle. So they would be taught how to observe their body and to be able to learn about their cycle, right? And they would be taught about that in a very, very deep way, right? So they would be taught the womanhood secrets by the women who are taking them through the process, and be given a very deep education on how to transition from girlhood to womanhood, to become a wife, to become a mother, to become a grandmother. They would be given that education during that time. And in fact, in our culture, we normally say that a woman's cycle is when she is conversing with God. It's when there's a cosmology that is connected with the moon and how the moon moves, and that's the cycle of a woman, and that's how she has that conversation with God, right? So when we miss educating our girls on that kind of education in a very, very deep way, that education which we can't talk about in depth because we don't know that education because we didn't go through that education, but it prepared women to be wives and all. But today we're missing that, and it has obviously caused our society to be fractured. To have men who are not prepared to be leaders and husbands and build homes and build families, and women who are not prepared to be the same. And so when we talk about some of the fabric of our morality has been in decay for the last 4 or 5 decades, we can look on the surface that, oh yeah, westernization brought this and that. But, in our own culture, we have to look at that education that was given to the man, that education that was given to the woman. And if those things are not, done, what happens to the young man when he becomes a man? What happens to the young woman when they become a grown woman?
Kingori, Wayaki, that is so poignant. Thank you for sharing that. Before I turn it over to you, Kingori, there is such depth in what you've shared, right? And the loss of this knowledge, the intimate knowledge of self, the intimate preparation to step fully into ourselves, whether we're stepping fully into being a man or stepping fully into being a woman. Because what's happened now is that while this education was very cultural and specific back then, today we've outsourced this education to schools, to teachers, right? But the job of teachers is not to teach us about self and our stages in life. The job of teachers is to give us an education in order to have certain skills, right, that we think are essential in this modern day. So you're right. Through this outsourcing, we've lost a lot of gender education that helped us step fully into who we are. And because the process of Irua for both men and women, outside of the cutting, right? Because I think we can agree that we don't want to, for me, I can agree we don't want to cut women, right? And men can make that decision about the cutting. But everything outside of that, the education that Kingori was talking about, is now lost. That on average, it's not being moved forward. And hence, some of the challenges you talked about, Wayaki. That is so eye-opening. Thank you for sharing that. So, Kingori, I'm going to pass it on to you to keep talking about what Wayaki kind of challenged you to add to the conversation.
Right. So, Wayaki has really put it very well. I'm not even going to add anything onto that, what he was talking about. I'm going to answer the question you had asked earlier, which is where can families who want to have their boys go through this process go today? And first I'll answer by saying not everything has been lost. Not even people who are going through circumcision today, Irua today, they're getting a lot of the knowledge. The question is, where can they go and do it the right way? And that's kind of a big debate today. The church scuttled the circumcision process because they felt that a lot of what was being taught was not in line with Christianity. And then later, they realized, that wasn't smart. And they said, okay, no, we're going to allow it. We're going to allow even to have some kerera being given, but we are going to be the ones taking care of that process, right? And so we have a generation of people who have been circumcised by the church. If you go to Kenya, you'll find them. And I'll argue those are better. Those are better off than those who just kind of went home and just healed and never learned anything and just went about their lives believing that now they are a man. And they are. We don't want to take anything away from anyone who's gone through this because there has been some knowledge transfer. Don't get me wrong. Even though it has not been perhaps as deep as it could be, you can't take away something, you can't take anything away from them. And a lot of folks anyway end up finding that information in a roundabout way later on in life. And we know our hope is that they end up being whole at some point. But today, there is a huge push led by Keama that has been in operation for, I want to say, over a decade, where they've taken this back, right? They've taken this mantle back, and they are preparing sessions for these young men to go through Irua in a way that's very in line with our culture. And this information is now flowing back. So you may see a young person in their early 20s who has a much broader spectrum of what it is to be a man than someone in their 40s, because they've started being given this information now, and they're going into high school better prepared than many of the other previous generations before. But the beauty of it is that when you start recreating these things, if you are a man out there and you never went through it, never got the right information during this process, it's not late. Right now, you can go and talk to these elders and get that kedera. And because you're much wiser and more capable of processing, it'll do you a lot more good than perhaps it would do a younger boy back, when they're going through it as a teen. So it is the right time to be asking that question, because right now, if you go into any keama out there, and just by the way, if you don't know where to start, go to YouTube and search Kedera Keirua, and whoever you see giving that information is one of the people you can actually just reach out to through that YouTube channel, and say, or whatever number they've posted, and say, who can I talk to? I live in this area. Especially if you're in Kenya, there are many resources. Who can I talk to in that area? And most likely they'll find you a resource and say, go talk to this particular elder. And as you do that, do some due diligence. Try, now start wondering, okay, what Kiama is that? Go ask some questions, because you're a grown up. It won't be funneled through a process. It will be a good dialogue, I'm sure of that. And better, you'll be able to discern what kind of group am I about to engage with. And if you have questions, you can always reach out to us through this podcast, and we'll try and help you, guide you through those steps. But I want to say, sorry, go ahead, Jerry.
No, sorry for interrupting, Kingori. I actually thought you had finished your thought, and I was just going to say, this is such good information, and just where someone can get this information regardless of age to kind of help round you out. And we're not saying that somebody is not rounded or not whole. We're just saying that there is more information out there that you can get if you are naturally curious. My question for you, Kingori, is this Kiama, do they also have this education for girls or women, or is it just for boys and men?
So Kiama is a male organization, but there are jamas that are run by women who it is their responsibility to bring these girls up in the right way. And there are areas where they're active. The good news is, if you're talking to a Mudhuri wa Kiama, they'll know who the women in those jamas are, because most of the time it's their wives, right? So it's still the right place to go. Go talk to those elders who are most likely the ones you'll see, talking about this topic. And then, you can ask that question. I have a girl. I would like them to be informed, right? We're saying we have passed Iruarea Kahio, sure. But what about Iruarea Omo? What about that mental and spiritual part of it? Is that important for our girls? And I think the answer is yes. There's so much that our young ladies don't know about themselves that they need to be educated about. And it is the best process for them to learn about it. Very few, we've had controversial groups out there that are talking about, the return of the female circumcision. But that idea doesn't have much traction. And so chances are the groups you're going to be talking to, and we can guide you if you want to know who to talk to, on the ground, someone who can take you to the right people, so that you avoid using some of the stuff, taking on some of those steps. But there's a lot to learn, Jerry. There's a lot about godliness. There's a lot about self-respect. There's a lot about community respect. There's a lot about wealth. And remember, we keep talking about wealth from Mûgîkûyû perspective. It is health. It is peace of mind. It is physical, accumulation of what we typically call wealth. We're talking about legacy when we talk about wealth. We're talking, ire and ireri. Remember that that is something captured in the first few episodes. All these things, if you go back, you'll understand what we're talking about when we talk about wealth. It is not just how to go make some money. And this is also where taha comes in, or used to come in, which is raiding. And remember, they're not saying koya, weishi. It's not theft from the perspective of Mûgîkûyû back then. It wasn't theft. It's gotaha for a reason. And what is gotaha today? I mean, if I am sitting down with young men and we're talking about gotaha, we won't be talking about how they can go raid. We'll be talking about entrepreneurship, how they can broaden their wealth capacity moving forward, so that they're not just thinking, how can I be employed and just hold on to a job, and that's good, it's great, but you have to broaden that horizon a little bit and start thinking career choices, thinking in terms of, like I said, entrepreneurship, and how to really regain our own wealth mechanisms and create new ones, create new streams of revenue for and also be able to think as a community. Those are the kind of concepts that today we should be talking about and should be engaging our young people in.
So beautiful. But I'm going to confess, I just learned something, that Kiama is Council of Men, right? I always knew that, but I never knew Jama. So I just learned it today. That's a Council of Women, right? So thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Actually, let me just add a little point. Jama are actually seven types of Jama. And one of them is Jamaya Atumia. But there are several. Okay. Yes. So even Kiama is a Jama. And it's one of the Jamas, right? And it's called Jamaya Bere, And then you have another one that was called Jamaya Ita. And we can't really get into it, but there was Jamaya ya Rika kana Jamaya Marika. In fact, I can talk about that because it's relevant here. When the young men went through this circumcision process, when they went through Irua, they were ushered into a Jama, which is a council. And once they were getting into that council, Jamaya Rika, they were now bound by their Rika. And Rika is the age group that you're going through this circumcision process with, the people you shed blood together on that day. You are now a brotherhood, and you would get a name. So if it's like this year, I'm sure the people who are going through this might end up being called Jamaya COVID, right? We've had other different ones. Jamaya Beshajero, that was 2019, or when there was new money that was going through Kenya. So there is a name that you'll be given. In fact, even my name Kengori is Arika, that was tied to my great-grandfather when he was going through that process. And many of us are carrying names of those Rikas. And it's if you find that you are one of those people who's holding on to a name of a Rika, you should also go and find out, what is my other name? Because you do have another name. But now that once you enter that Rika, you're being bound together with 9 other age people who went through Marika, and that's why it's called Jamarika Kana Marika. And you find, and that becomes the 9 years back to back of people who have gone through Irua were part of one Rika. And that Rika was responsible for making sure that whole Rika has a good name, that they have they used to challenge each other and hold each other accountable. And there was a lot to learn you became an advocate in the Rika, you became a judge, you became an executioner if there was something that needed to be done to do something. There was a lot of learning at a very young age on justice, because you were within a small group where you did it and you were participating fully as that Rika. And we say Rika retiu mago because you can never disown that Rika. You can never say, I am now no longer Rika Rea COVID, if that's what you end up being. You can never do that. And in fact, you end up holding that name high as a flag, as a badge, and you're saying, yeah, me us, we are Rika Rea COVID, and we want to be known for, being exceptional in 1, 2, 3 things. And then there's other Rikas, Rika Rea Nyoba or Meherega, which is, family councils. And then there was, that Rika Rea Kengore, which was everyone, the whole community. Whenever you've seen something like mob justice happening, that's actually a Rika Rea Kengore. As in, the guys have decided, you know what? We don't care about any other judicial process right now. This guy, we're going to deal with him right here and right now because he's gone away ahead. That was Jamaya Kengore. And that could happen. Those are the people used to put someone in a beehive and roll him down the hill. It's because I was saying, huyu Jama, way above, he's gone out of control. We don't need to even take him to Kiama. We've taken him there before, and whatever they did to him wasn't enough. This guy, we just need him gone. That is Jamaya Kengore, and it used to be an impromptu Jama, but it was recognized. It was seen as a council, and whatever they did, it's on the community collectively, because but there were all these 7 Jamas, and the one even for Atumia, who the Atumia one was very powerful, because remember we say women are the ones who used to be they used to control the means of production for the most part in the community. They used to deal with many issues like marital problems. When men went out of hand and you had a situation where a man is notorious for, let's say, beating his wife, it is this Jama that used to deal with that. And sometimes they would even get physical with these men. There were many avenues to getting justice, but the overall, this high court was the now Kiama, and that's why it has that it's held up, and it still holds up in our community today, because it is the most important of those councils from a perspective of it is a point of escalation.
Fascinating. No, thank you for that. And that's such good information. And the part that I have, the biggest takeaway I've gotten from that is that not only was this a process, right, where you got self-knowledge, community knowledge, spiritual knowledge, you are connected to your ancestors on both sides, right, through shedding the blood. But the biggest thing you've also shared right now is the idea of belonging. That when you went through this process, you belonged to a Rika, you belonged to a certain Jama. There was a sense of belonging that also came from this. I love that. Thank you so much. So maybe I could also ask you, Wayaken, maybe we've already covered it and you want to move us somewhere else, which is the overall, I think we've covered it, the significance of the Irua, the whole process.
We've covered it slightly, and before I touch on it, I want to say the sense of community. I wanted to add this, teach our listeners the saying that says "No banarika itu managwa." Those are the 2 things that you can never ever separate yourself from. You can never separate the fact that you were born of a certain house, and you can never separate the fact that you belonged to a certain Rika when you went through the process of Irua. But to get back to the importance, is it creates the next generation. The way King Ori has said that, 9 years create, one Rika. And the Mûgîkûyû year was, I think, 6 months, as opposed to 12 calendar months. So 4.5 years create one Rika. You're creating the next generation. It was like the military to a certain extent, where there are levels. You graduate, you move to another level. You graduate, you move to another level. And if there's order in the society, you have to create that order to be able to create a functioning society where you have functioning adults. And so today, to a certain extent, we are doing it, and there's that the Kiama has really brought back that process and the importance of education. But you think about it, if we have, for the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, if we have our young men being educated through this process, learning about themselves, and even the young women, even obviously it's illegal to go through that process of circumcision, but if they were to get the mental circumcision that or that self-knowledge that they need to be prepared to go into society and become functioning women, or learn about womanhood, and then men learn about manhood. If you think about how it can transform our society, our culture, if it's done for the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, in 40 years, you can see a different culture where, you have thriving families, you have a functioning moral society. So that process, I think, really, it's what some people have missed. And, we talked about this when we were doing pre-pod. Is the cutting the important part, or is the education the important part? I mean, you find that you have old men who may be behaving like children because they didn't get that knowledge, So that education is really important, and it's really, really what creates the society of tomorrow. If we can create young men and young women who are educated, who are self-aware, who know who they are, you create a better society.
Beautiful. I love that. So maybe I think we should kind of close out the experience by talking a little bit about who did it. Unless there's something else we want to talk about it. In my mind, I kind of want to know who actually did the Irua process, the physical part, the mental part, and the spiritual and moral part. Who did that process? Who led it?
I don't know if we want to talk about the process itself. I don't think we should talk about the process itself, but they were designated people who were selected and given the requisite education to do it. Maybe we can talk about, for the young man or young woman back then who was going through this, they would have a mentor who would help them go through the process and learn the process. For the young man, it was his motiri, and motiri comes from the word hotira, which is to support, right? I won't go into the detail. The beauty of, and Kingori mentioned this, the beauty of the Kikuyu language is that it can hide so much wisdom. When you speak in English, you can't hide anything. You can't, this podcast is listened to by a lot of different people, including children. And sometimes there's some things we can't say because you can say them in Kikuyu, but we can't say them in English because they are too explicit, right? But the mutiri was the young man who would support the young novice going through this process. And that would be a young man of sound character, of sound moral upbringing, who wouldn't be a relative. It would be a young man in the community. It wouldn't be from the father's side or the mother's side. It would be a young man who was a standout, who would be this young man's mentor or support for the rest of his life and going through even when they were older. And they would never leave each other, so to speak. For the young woman, it was not a motiri, but it was the young mentor would be called wakeri. So wakeri was the girl who... Wakeri comes from the word gokera. Gokera is to pass. And so the young girl would be... The young mentor would be called wakeri because she's the one who would, for lack of a better description, hold a girl's hand and pass her through from being a young girl to become a young woman. So she's the one who would create that passage, so to speak, and would mentor her on, like today, for example, if I may say that, some of the things, so when you're in high school, when you're learning about morality and sexuality and, you don't have a mentor to teach you those things. So this would be the responsibility of the mutiri and the wakeri. There would be, it would be somebody who would be a confidant who you could go and ask, I don't understand about this. Can you explain to me? And they would have passed through that process and they would explain to you. And it would be somebody you would trust. And it would be somebody who you could turn to even when you passed another level and maybe you are a young bride or a young husband and you are married and you had questions about marriage. This wakeri or this mutiri was what we call wanaruana. Wanaruana means somebody who has seen already. There's a saying that says wanaruana anarumenya. Like, you should always trust the advice of somebody who has gone through the same experience. If they are of sound character, sound mind, they can be able to explain to you that, I've been through that process and this is what happens. They would be able to give you solid advice. So these young men and young women would come out with a mentor for life, somebody who could be able to hold their hand and guide them throughout life. And their relationship was like brother, sister, brother. There was a brotherhood between those two, and there was a sisterhood between those two for life. In fact, the wakeri would play a significant role during the udhoni process of the young woman.
My mind is so beautifully blown, right? To also realize, I'm connecting what you said and what Kingori said earlier, is that this process was so well thought out that we had a built-in assessment of readiness, for example, from the mama, right? It was not just you just thrown in. There was an assessment. There was a process. It was a journey before you were ready. And someone else would say, someone of authority would objectively say, this young man or this young girl, this young boy or this young girl is ready. But not only was there a built-in assessment, when you went through this process with your age mates, not only did you gain community from your age mates, but there was also built-in mentorship. That you had somebody that you just said, the motiri or the wakeri, who had gone through this journey before you and became your lifelong partner, your lifelong mentor, your lifelong guide to help you as you navigated this step and different steps of your life. This is so powerful and this is so beautiful. I love it so much, and I think that this is a great place to end the podcast, right? In terms of, we're going to talk about where we go next. But before we do that, Kingori, let me pass it on to you and see if there's any final words before Wayaki tells us what the next episode will be about. So Kingori, let me pass it on to you.
Yeah, so our listeners are getting a taste of what this very important process was about. And I want to say that this was the most important stage in a person's life and still is today, or ought to be. Because much of what guides a young man or a young woman in their lives today or should be learnt at that very important stage. A lot of consciousness in their role in society would be awakened at that point. One that I would be remiss if we did not mention was actually around preparedness for marriage, because it started here. It started with understanding your body, And then it started, and then there was a very strong insistence on chastity during this process. Some people today have heard that once you go through Irua as a young man, hasa umefunguliwa, go and find some young ladies and, do whatever it is you want to do. But that was not the thinking originally. Chastity for both men and women was very important. And so much so, if we talk, I think we know so much in this area about how girls were asked to save themselves for marriage. But I don't think we understand how much that same lesson had also been instilled in the young men. Even though there was a lot of teaching about being, a vibrant man and, being interested in women, and that was encouraged. People were given lessons on saving their, in Kikuyu they say megue arrows, right? So much so that when the young man was going home, after going through because I think we didn't mention this, but you spent your first healing days out, not at home. About 9 days were spent elsewhere. And there was another section, those are now more details, but on the day of coming home, you would be given a quiver and a bow, a quiver full of arrows and a bow. And we know that, you heard Wayaki mention very elegantly about the Motiri and the Wakeri. There were other people who were just as important, or who also contributed to this. There was Moruithia, who was the actual person who did the cutting, who was a Modomogo. There was a Moruitheria, who was a father of one of the boys going through this, who used to be the one who, kind of that age group that's being circumcised together, he will also be their father moving forward, all of them. They'll now have a third father figure and mother figure that they will now be able to go to. Who was the first one? Their own father. The second one is their maternal uncle. And now they have this man whose home they had utilized to go through this process. That became another father that you could always go to if you need someone outside of your family to talk to. But at the same time, when you guys are learning all this kerera, the initiates were learning all this kerera, even their parents were being taught a lot about how to handle you moving forward. They had to also understand something has changed. And especially the mothers. They needed to be given a lot of kerera around how to handle you. And one of the things that happened is when this young man came home, they would give this quiver of arrows. They were instructed to give the quiver of arrows to their mother. And their mother would put it in her home, in the Moshia, in the Nyoba, at one of the lofts outside. And that meant that the mother was now kind of interested in the boy's chastity, that he may not waste his arrows. And that's what we're saying. Gikuyu is very clever in hiding these things so that it looks like, I'm just keeping a quiver of arrows. But it's a reminder to everyone that this young man is not ready for marriage, right? And therefore should not be going around gallivanting and spoiling girls who are supposed to be keeping themselves pure. So there was a lot of lesson. Yes, you're a very young man, you're very strong, you can go out there. Yes, you have the capacity. Yes, you have even the intention. But we're going to hold you back a little bit until the time is right. And that's when it was important for the young man to now, be very concerned with security of the community, be very concerned with getting some wealth, so that wealth will be part of what he uses to go and go through the ratio process so that he can have a bride. So this was a very important time. And he's ready. He really wants to go. He wants a wife tomorrow, but he told boss, bibi hawezi pata bibi without some kind of wealth of your own. So why don't we just focus you first there? And as we go on in the season, I know we'll be talking about marriage. We'll talk about this a little bit, but chastity was important. alcohol is not something that young men drank. Let me just put it out there because it's very important. Today, we've seen situations where Irua has been used as an opportunity for young men to get into drugs and alcohol. And being now that you're a man, you can go ahead and drink. That is not even today the way things should be done. Alcohol is not something that's going to add any value to your life as a young person. And these are the sort of things that we should be fighting against today, and including in any Irua process. Young men and alcohol, that is a recipe for disaster. And we want upright men. And we want young men who are responsible, young men who understand they're defending everyone in the community. And my prayer, and I know, Mwene Nyaga is with us on this issue, is that we want our young men to be upright, and we want our young women to be upright. And so this is an area that I would say, all listeners out there, ask yourself what you can do to contribute to that future. And with that, I'll say, Nevayo.
You guys just keep blowing my mind over and over again. I mean, what you've added here, Kengori, the idea, I know earlier we talked about kirira and awakening a person's consciousness and awareness of their community and their selves. But then you brought this big thing, right? Which is, a lot of times when we talk about, for example, Tanzanians and Waswahili, people like to talk about their preparedness for marriage, right? And we say, oh yeah, those people, they're and Ugandans too, they prepare their people for marriage. But what you're telling us here is that marriage was such an important event, and it was important to be good in marriage, right? For the men and the women, that this process also imbued within it the idea of preparedness for marriage, for our men and our women. I think that is so beautiful. The idea of uprightness and chastity and readiness, right? That the fact that chastity was a value, not just for women, right? But a value for men too. It was a communal value. And when you talked about the mother almost hiding the arrows until her son is ready, that is so stunningly beautiful in its ideas. And then the last thing that I loved so much is you talked about, Wayaki talked about the motiri and the wakiri, the mentors. But now you're gaining a third father, right? And another person to take you down through this journey. So this whole idea of belonging, you are part of a community. And the community was so complex that it starts to give real meaning to the idiom or the saying that, it takes a village. In our pre-colonial society, in our society, in our community, it really does take a village. So beautiful. So Wayaki, let me ask this question. You may have some additional thoughts and you're welcome to bring them in, right? Before we tell our listeners where are we going to go next week, because the next episode is so exciting. And I know a lot of people have been waiting for it. So Wayaki, let me turn it over to you.
Okay, yeah. Kengori has really closed really well. I do want to say one thing about the additional father. So in our culture, we have three sets of parents. Your biological parents, the parents of the home of the Muruwidia, the husband and wife, and then, of course, in the future, when you get married, your in-laws. So you have three sets of parents. I just wanted to add that as a point of education to our listeners. So for the next couple of episodes, we're going to go deep into the kirira of Odhoni and marriage. And it's a very interesting topic and has a lot of misinformation, or a lot of people ask the questions, what are what is dowry? How does the process work? We're going to try and do a really good job of, making it simple to understand and for the most part, understanding the philosophy behind the process, so that we can be able to move forward. And that's what we're going to talk about.
Thank you so much, Kengori Wakanyi, for everything you have brought to this episode. Thank you so much, Wayaki, for all the knowledge you have poured onto us. We are excited for the next episode because I know it's the one topic we've been getting a lot of questions on, around, rurashio and just the entire process. Because like you said, Wayaki, there's a lot of misinformation around it. And let's finally get to understand the depth, the philosophy, right, behind this experience and this process. So thank you both for setting us up. And I look forward to the next episode. Thank you for listening and for joining us on this journey where we honor our history, where we honor our heritage, where we honor our ancestors. We are grateful. You can find Matire Gemi on social media, which is Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And you can also find us on Clubhouse, where we will occasionally host some live discussions following some of our episodes. We look forward to seeing you. Our website is matire-gemi.simplecast.com. Our email is matire.gemi@gmail.com. And this podcast is hosted, produced, and contributed to by Wayaki Gishanga, Kingori Kanyi, and Jerry Diho. Thank you, and please share this widely.